Winston as Churchill, The World Crisis, Volume 4, Chapter 5, Intervention. The Bolshevik truce and later peace with the Central Powers produced a far-reaching reaction in Russia. On the same day that hostilities were suspended, December 2, 1917, Generals Kornilov and Alexeyev and Denikin raised a counter-revolutionary standard on the Don. Each had made his way to this refuge among the loyal Cossacks by routes of various hazards. There, among the rude surroundings of a primitive and loyal-hearted population, these military leaders presented a rallying point for all that was noblest in old Russia. What was their political authority? The imperial regime was discredited with all classes. The Tsar had abdicated and was already approaching the slaughterhouse of Ekaterinburg. Bolshevism, still masqueraded as democratic progress, carried in the pressure of events to a violent manifestation. In the domestic sphere, nothing could stand against the land for the peasants, Soviets for all. But the safety and integrity of Russia against the invader and the honor of the Russian name plighted to the Allies were impulsive and commanding notes to sound. True, they appealed only to individuals, and these were scattered along the immense fronts and vast spaces of the interior. But the trumpet call was carried by the wind across the steppes and echoed by the mountains, and everywhere, in every class, in every town, in every village there were ears to hear it. If world revolution had reared its head, world civilization was still in the field. More than 20 states and peoples spread over 5 continents were marching against the Central Empires and had laid Russia low. All the seas of the world bore their unimpedable ships to the western battlefields. Mighty America, far across the ocean, resounded with a clang of reinforcing preparation. Statesmen, whose names were household words, stood at the head of vast organizations. Although Russia had been struck down and battered, the course continued. Despotic governments should be destroyed and not replaced by other tyrannies in other forms. For these Russian patriots, there was also the honor of the Russian arms and the inheritance of Peter the Great to guard or to die in guarding. The rise and achievements of the Russian volunteer army should certainly form the theme of an historical monograph to be read with gratitude by all their comrades in the British Empire, in France, in Italy, and in the United States, as well as in the smaller states whose freedom is safe today. As news of the mutilations of the Russian fatherland and of the shame in which it had been involved gradually permeated the enormous empire, the knowledge of disaster which appalled the many animated the few. 20 unknown battles comparable to the fights of Garibaldi or Hofer or de Laurelin against astounding odds marked the growth of a troop of desperate refugees into a substantial military entity. One by one the leaders fell. Kornilov was killed at the end of March. Kaledin, the leader of the Don Cossacks, committed suicide after a temporary defeat. The heaviest loss of all was Alexeyev, a strategist of the rank of Foch and Ludendorff, long versed in the highest affairs of the Russian state. He survived the hardships of the struggle only until September 1918, when he was succeeded by Denikin, who possessed both the qualities and limitations of a tough, sensible, steady and honorable military man. In the ups and downs of civil war, the Russian volunteer army widely extended the limits of its authority during the latter part of 1918. But for a more detailed account of its adventures and achievements, our retrospect can find no place. While all else was at first disputed and confused, a sense of association with the great world outside was a sure foundation upon which the authority of the counter-revolutionary leaders could rest, and this association was soon to take a practical form. At the time of the revolution, France, Britain, and the United States were engaged in supplying munitions to Russia on a gigantic scale. These munitions had been purchased by Russia, Tsarist and revolutionary, upon loans. More than 600,000 tons of military material, apart from an equal quantity of coal, had been landed at Archangel and Murmansk. Thither, in the days of the Tsar, a railway 800 miles long from Petrograd had been built by the unrecorded sufferings of multitudes of war prisoners. The munitions and supplies lay stranded on the quays. The Bolshevik government had repudiated all the loans by which they had been purchased. They were therefore in equity the property of the Allies. But a far more urgent question was, into whose hands would they fall? A similar situation obtained at Vladivostok, where enormous importations had been made by the Americans and Japanese. Was all this mass of deadly material to replenish the arsenals of the Central Powers and prolong the war in indefinite slaughter? Ought it even to enable a recreant government, traitor to the Allies and the avowed foe of every civilized institution, to crush every form of opposition to its absolute sway? These issues arose in the winter of 1917. They became vital even before the Peace of Brest-Litovsk was signed. The terms of the treaty made it plain that the blockade of the Central Powers, on which such immense naval efforts had been concentrated, was to a large extent broken. The Germans obviously had Russia at their disposal. The granaries of the Ukraine and Siberia, the oil of the Caspian, or the resources of a vast continent could, it seemed to us, henceforth be drawn upon to nourish and maintain the German armies now increasing so formidably in the West, and the populations behind them. Germany had in fact achieved in the early months of 1918 all and more than she might have won 2 years before had Falkenhayn not imprudently preferred to break his teeth on the stones of Verdun. How far or how soon these reliefs could become effective was uncertain, but the subsidiary arrangements made with the Ukraine revealed the immediate German intention of overrunning that country and drawing from it the largest quantities of supplies. No one at this time saw any prospect of a speedy end to the war, and there seemed no reason to doubt that Germans and Austrians would have the time, as they certainly had the power, to draw new life almost indefinitely from the giant empire prostrated before them. Finally, the Germans were in process of transporting 70 divisions, comprising more than 1 million men, and 3,000 guns with all their munitions, from the Russian to the Western Front. The Austrians had similarly reinforced their Italian front, and further reinforcements were moving westward in a continuous stream. The French army had scarcely recovered from the mutinies of 1917, and the British, in their efforts to take the pressure off the French and secure them a breathing space, had bled themselves white in ceaseless offensives from Arras to Passchendaele. Such was the dark situation on the morrow of the Russian collapse. It was soon to become even graver in the explosion of the greatest battles ever fought. The reconstruction of an eastern front against Germany and the withholding of Russian supplies from the Central Powers seemed even from the end of 1917 vital to win the war. The military representatives of the Supreme War Council accordingly recommended on December 23 that all national troops in Russia, who were determined to continue the war, should be supported by every means in our power. In Siberia, one ally above all others could act with swiftness and overwhelming power. Japan was near, fresh, strong, ready, and intimately affected. The counter-argument was weighty. If Japan was loosed against Russia, the Bolsheviks, with the support of the Russian people, might, it was said, actually join hands with Germany against the Allies. The Japanese showed themselves not unwilling to make exertions. They were prepared to take control of a considerable section of the Siberian Railway, but they said that American participation would be unpopular in Japan. On December 31, the British government opened these possibilities to President Wilson. The United States expressed themselves averse from either solitary intervention by Japan or combined intervention by America and Japan. The Japanese were offended by this attitude, which the British government at first felt bound to endorse. They thought they ought to be entrusted with an intervention at Vladivostok which might be agreed upon, since the development of hostile German influence on the shores of the Pacific would be a peculiar menace to Japan. The British government, with the support of the French, at the end of January decided to propose that Japan should be invited to act as the mandatory of the Allies. President Wilson remained adverse to all intervention and especially to isolated action by Japan. The Japanese, on the other hand, stipulated that if Japan were to act as mandatory for the powers, she must receive American aid in gold and steel. The shock of the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, Ludendorff's swiftly following onslaught in the West, and the intense crisis which resulted, extorted from the two desperately struggling allies increasingly vehement appeals. President Wilson, however, remained unconvinced. For 4 precious months, a seesaw process between Japan and America continued, in which one or the other successively demurred to every variant proposed by the French and British. However, the terrible conflict in France and Belgium and the increasing German exploitation of Russia prevented arguments of inexorable force. They were aided from an unexpected quarter. Trotsky was now Minister of War, and with remarkable energy was creating a Red Army to defend alike the revolution and Russia. On March 28, he informed our representative at Moscow, Mr. Lockhart, that he saw no objection to Japanese forces entering Russia to resist German aggression, if the other allies cooperated and certain guarantees were given. He asked for a British naval commission to reorganize the Russian Black Sea Fleet and for a British officer to control the Russian railways. Lastly, even Lenin was said to be not opposed to foreign intervention against the Germans, subject to guarantees against interference in Russian politics. Every effort was made by the British to obtain a formal invitation from the Bolshevik leaders. This would have been all-important in overcoming the reluctance of the United States. Probably the Bolsheviks were only maneuvering to gain a measure of external sanction for their regime in its early days and to baffle and divide the patriotic antagonisms which were arming against them. Something else was needed to clinch the issue and bring the 5 great allies into practical agreement. This new incentive was now to be supplied. There suddenly appeared in Russia a foreign factor, unique in character and origin. On the outbreak of war, a number of Czechoslovaks resident in Russia had voluntarily entered the Russian army. A body of Czechoslovak prisoners of war had enlisted in the Serbian Voluntary Division in the Dobruja. Czechoslovaks had also deserted in considerable numbers and joined their compatriots in the Russian army, both during the early months of the war and notably after Brusilov's victory on the Styr in 1916. These men had followed the guidance of the venerable Professor Masaryk, who had lived in London during 1914, 15 and 16 as a refugee from Austrian animosity, and kept alive the conception not only of Bohemian nationality, but of a considerable Czechoslovak state. The bond was purely of intellect and sentiment, but it proved in men of high moral superior to all the strains of this exceptional time. These soldiers, separated from their homes and families by immense distances, by a world of war and infinite confusion, and finally by the offences they had committed against the Austrian government, preserved a disciplined comprehension of national and international causes and were entirely immune from all local Russian influence. The Tsar's government had embodied the Czechoslovaks as military units in the Russian army, but it had regarded with some misgiving the loyalty of foreigners who had denied the authority of their legal sovereign. After the outbreak of the Russian Revolution, however, Professor Masaryk went to Russia, brought about the consolidation of all Czechoslovak units in one force, placed them under the red and white flag of Bohemia, and procured for them in Paris the status of an allied army. From the moment of the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, they held themselves fully armed at the disposition of the Allies for the general purposes of the war. On a much larger scale and with the necessary differentiations, they resembled the Scottish archers of Louis XI and the Irish Brigade of Sarsfield, or the Swiss Guard of Louis XVI, and like them, far from home and all that home means, surrounded by alien people whose passion did not stir and whose habits did not attract them, they lived a life by themselves. But in contrast to their forerunners, they were linked with what had by now become almost a world course in which they steadfastly persevered. By a continued collective study of the course of the war, by constant gymnastics and intense group consciousness, they held their heads high through all the welter, and in the crash of the Russian Empire remained, among innumerable foes unmoved, unshaken, unseduced, unterrified. When the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk ended the Russian resistance to Germany, the Czechoslovak army demanded to be transported to the Western Front. The Bolsheviks were equally anxious that they should leave Russia. A free exit was promised to the Czechs by the Bolshevik commander-in-chief and embodied in a formal agreement between the Allies and the Soviet government in Moscow on March 26. The Siberian Railway offered the safest route, and the Czechs began their journey by Kursk, Penza, Chelyabinsk, and Samara. They had started with 42,500 men, but their numbers were increased as they proceeded by fresh recruits from among the Czechoslovak prisoners of war to a total of about 60,000. It was natural that the Germans should view these arrangements with disapproval. To prevent the manhood of two army corps of trustworthy troops from being transported round the world to the Western Front became an object of urgent consequence to the enemy general staff. Exactly what pressures they put upon the Soviet authorities is not yet known. At any rate, they were effective. Lenin and Trotsky freed themselves from their engagements to the Czechs by treachery. Measures were rapidly taken under German direction to intercept and capture the Czech troops on their long journey. Many thousands of German and Austrian prisoners in Russian hands were hurriedly armed and, under the supervision of German officers, began to assume military formations. While Trotsky, on the one hand, was settling with Mr. Lockhart in detail the safe conduct of the Czechs through Russia, he was also moving his Red Guard forces to their appropriate stations. On May 26, the first echelon of Czechoslovak artillery arrived at Irkutsk. Their agreement with the Bolsheviks had left them only 30 carabines and some grenades for personal self-defense. When the trains steamed into the station, the Czechs found themselves in the presence of a large and greatly superior force of Red Guards. They were ordered to surrender their few remaining arms within a period of 15 minutes. While the Czechs, nearly all of whom were unarmed, were discussing the situation on the railway station platform, a machine gun fired upon them from the station building. The Czechs did not succumb. The training of the Red Army at this time had not progressed beyond a knowledge of communism, the execution of prisoners, and ordinary acts of brigandage and murder. In a few minutes, with their 30 carabines and hand grenades, the Czechs not only defeated but captured and disarmed their despicable assailants. Equipped with the captured weapons, they overcame a few days later new forces sent against them by the local Soviet and reported what had occurred to their army headquarters. The whole of the Czech troops thereupon ceased to deliver up their arms and, wherever they stood, assumed an attitude of active self-defense, which passed quite rapidly into a vigorous counterattack. Their very dispersion now became the foundation of an extraordinary power. 11,000 had already arrived at Vladivostok. The rest were scattered all along the Trans-Siberian Railway and its subsidiary lines from 100 miles west of the Ural Mountains to the Pacific Ocean. By June 6, 1918, they were in possession of all the railway stations between Omsk and Krasnoyarsk. Their comrades still in European Russia had gained corresponding successes. Their control of the vital communications rapidly extended eastward to Nizhny Udinsk and Penza in the west. On June 28, they assumed control of Vladivostok. By July 6, they were moving out of Nikolsk towards Harbin and Tabarovsk. They took charge of Irkutsk on July 13. By the third week of July, an immense area of Russia, several hundred miles broad and 3,000 miles long, including the backbone connections from the Volga River almost to Lake Baikal, was in the effectual possession of these strangers, thus foully attacked when seeking to leave the country in virtue of signed agreements. The pages of history recall scarcely any parallel episode at once so romantic in character and so extensive in scale. We may anticipate the culmination of this effort. Those Czechs who had already reached and made themselves masters of Vladivostok determined to return to the rescue of their compatriots, cut off in central Siberia, and by about the middle of September 1918, railway communication had again been established along the whole Trans-Siberian route. Thus, through a treacherous breach of faith, by a series of accidents and chances which no one in the world had foreseen, the whole of Russia from the Volga River to the Pacific Ocean, a region almost as large as the continent of Africa, had passed as if by magic into the control of the Allies. The message sent by the Czechoslovak army to Professor Masaryk in the United States at the end of July epitomizes the situation. In our opinion, it is most desirable and also possible to reconstruct a Russian-German front in the east. We ask for instructions as to whether we should leave for France or whether we should stay here to fight for Russia at the side of the Allies and of Russia. The health and spirits of our troops are excellent. The Czechoslovak National Council, residing at Washington, on this observed, Professor Masaryk has since then instructed the forces in Siberia to remain there for the present. The Czechoslovak army is one of the Allied armies, and it is as much under the orders of the Versailles War Council as the French or American army. No doubt the Czechoslovak boys in Russia are anxious to avoid participation in a possible civil war in Russia, but they realize at the same time that by staying where they are, they may be able to render far greater services both to Russia and the Russian cause than if they were transported to France. They are at the orders of the Supreme Councils of Allies. These astounding events, as they proceeded, were decisive upon the action of the great Allies. On July 2, 1918, the Supreme War Council had made from Versailles a further appeal to President Wilson to agree to the support of the Czech forces. The President thereupon proposed the dispatch of an international force of British, Japanese, and United States troops, avowedly to restore and preserve the communications of the Czechs. The next day, the British government, in concert with their allies, resolved to extend to them military help. On July 5, the United States announced that they had decided upon a limited intervention in Siberia for the purpose of rendering protection to the Czechoslovaks against the Germans and to assist in the efforts at self-government or self-defense in which the Russians themselves may be ready to accept assistance. They also proposed to send a detachment of the Young Men's Christian Association to offer moral guidance to the Russian people. 2 Japanese divisions, 7,000 Americans, and 2 British battalions, under the command of Colonel Johnson and of Colonel John Ward, a Labour Member of Parliament, 3,000 French and Italians, all under the supreme command of Japan, were set in motion, landed as rapidly as possible at Vladivostok, and proceeded westward along the railway. Concurrently with this, an international force of 7,000 or 8,000 men, mainly British and all under British command, disembarked in June and July at Murmansk and Archangel. They were welcomed by the inhabitants, who expelled the Bolsheviks and formed a local administration. Agreements were signed between this northern government and the British commander, whereby the local authorities undertook to assist the Allies to defeat German aggression, and the Allied governments became responsible for finance and food. In Siberia, within the widespread picket line, for it was little more, of the Czechoslovaks, an anti-Bolshevik Russian government began to organize itself at Omsk. Broadly speaking, Siberia bore the same relation to Russia as Canada does to Great Britain. The apparition of the Czechs, their sudden extraordinary activity and success, their manifest personal superiority to the armed political rebel of Bolshevism, had created an enormous enclave in Sovdepia, within which a Russian administration and military organization could be set on foot on a considerable scale. In the summer of 1918, a provisional government was formed at Omsk, aiming primarily at the convocation of a constituent assembly for all Russia. This government passed through various transformations during its tenure. It reflected the chaos reigning throughout Russia, when everybody was eager to talk and many were ready to kill, and no large body of persons could be got to agree upon anything for any reasonable space of time. Even before the armistice cast its fatal depression upon all anti-Bolshevik movements, the tide of Siberian fortunes had begun to ebb. The Czechs were already varying somewhat in well-doing. Their toils were ceaseless and their dangers increasing. Their own political opinions were of an advanced character, and accorded ill with White Russian views. They were, moreover, exasperated by constant contact with Russian instability and mismanagement. Their far-spread southern line in October 1918 had been forcibly contracted by Red pressure in front and around them. Already also, by September 1918, there were 2 governments functioning side by side at Omsk, one for Siberia and the other claiming to be an all-Russian body. Meanwhile, Cossack and anti-Bolshevik officers had been energetically raising armed forces. As these forces grew in size and influence, they overshadowed both these mushroom administrations. It became increasingly evident that all would have soon to fight for their lives, and in these straits the military point of view quickly became predominant. The original Omsk government yielded readily to this new pressure. Its brother government, on the contrary, became a hotbed of socialist conspiracy. The rival administrations counterworked each other. The futility of these proceedings in the face of impending slaughter led to a military coup d'etat. On November 17, a week after the armistice, the leaders of the new armies forcibly appropriated one government and arrested the principal members of the other. They decided, probably wisely in the desperate circumstances, to concentrate all power in the hands of one man. They found this man in Admiral Kolchak, the former commander of the Black Sea Fleet. At the same time, far to the south in the province of the Don, the Russian volunteer army, now under Denikin, had already made itself master of a large and fertile area, and before the end of the year was destined to advance to Ekaterinoda, after an operation in which over 30,000 Bolsheviks were made prisoners. Such was the surprising transformation of the Russian situation which followed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. The snows of winter war had whitened 5/6 of Red Russia, but the springtime of peace, for all other blessing, was soon to melt it all again. To the preoccupations which these developments caused the Allies, another set of problems was added. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk had formally detached from the Russian Empire all her western provinces. The Germans evidently had in mind the creation of a chain of buffer states carved out of the Russian Empire to guard their eastern marches. We saw reproduced in the 20th century and 500 miles farther east a new version of Napoleon's plan for a confederation of the Rhine. Finland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Russian Poland, the Ukraine, Bessarabia, the Caucasus, were all to exercise under the guidance of a victorious Germany and in repulsion from a defeated and communist Russia the power of self-determination. They were to owe their liberty, if not their independence, to Germany, and the Russian Empire was to be stripped by one saber cut drawn across the map of Europe from Helsingfors to Batum and Baku of all the conquests of Peter and Catherine the Great. Lenin and Trotsky had agreed to this. Imperial Germany had now disappeared. The mighty center of the whole new system had been destroyed. Germany had yielded herself, disarmed and helpless, at the disposal of the conquerors, and her part for the time being was punctually to obey the orders they might give. Therefore all these states were released almost at a stroke, alike from their old allegiance and from their new. For several months the light of coming events had shone with increasing plainness. From August 1918 onwards the defeat of the Central Powers was certain. The only question were how complete it would be and how long delayed. Everyone wanted to get out of Bolshevik Russia, and to the desire for racial or national independence was added resolve to escape from a frightful reversion to barbarism and terror. The movement of opinion in every one of these countries was passionately decisive. Estonia declared independence on November 28, 1917, Finland on December 6, the Ukraine on December 18, Latvia on January 12, 1918, Lithuania on February 16, 1918. On April 9, Bessarabia contracted a union with Romania subject to autonomy. On April 22, the Transcaucasian Council declared the complete independence of its federal republic and claimed to place its territory outside the operation of the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. At the end of May, the Transcaucasian federal government dissolved into its constituent elements. Georgia formed an independent national government. The Armenian National Council assumed charge in Armenia. The Tatar National Council proclaimed the independence of Azerbaijan. All these movements may be said to have originated in the prospect of a war settlement in which Germany would have been the greatest power in Europe. They were now stimulated by the growing fear of Bolshevik aggression, which Germany was no longer likely to hold in check. As therefore the power of Germany waned, and when she suddenly collapsed entirely, every one of these states transferred their hopes and their loyalty to the League of Victorious Democracies, which from across the Atlantic Ocean and the English Channel, and over the battle lines in France and Italy, poured an irresistible avalanche of flame and steel upon the recoiling German-Austrian fronts. And when in the end all resistance fell in one stupendous crash, it was to the triumphant Western Allies that all these peoples and embryo governments rallied with joy and conviction. However, this transition did not take place without opposition. The Bolsheviks, who, on January 4, had joined with the French and Swedish governments in recognizing the independence of Finland, invaded Finland and captured Helsingfors on January 28, 1918. This was no ordinary war of troops and cannon. The Soviet Red Guards advanced by mob-like methods, and before them, more deadly than carnal weapon, sprang up the local forces of communist propaganda and revolt. 2 horrible pages in Finnish history were successively written. On March 1, a treaty of peace and amity was signed between the Finnish Republic and the Soviet. A Red Terror followed in Finland. But here the Germans intervened as rescuers. On April 3, a German division landed in Finland under the command of General von der Goltz. And the anti-communist Finns under General Mannersheim, an ex-officer of the Russian Imperial Guard, joined them in large numbers. The Soviet forces and local communists were scattered like chaff, and on April 13, Generals von der Goltz and Mannerheim reoccupied Helsingfors. Less than 3 months of communist rule had made an impression upon public opinion which a generation will not efface. The communist flight from the Finnish capital had been hurried. The corpses of the executed bourgeoisie cumbered the courtyards and corridors of the public offices. The dour northern people, roused to fury, took a merciless revenge upon their late oppressors. They were resolved to give them a lesson as lasting as that which they themselves had learned. A white terror, certainly not less bloody, succeeded the red. May 7 is regarded as the end of the Finnish Civil War, but it was by no means the end of the punishment inflicted not only upon the Finnish communists, but upon many harmless socialists and radicals in the unmeasured and undiscriminating resentment of the victors. So much for Finland. Immediately south of Finland, the 3 Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania found themselves in a peculiarly unhappy position. They were close neighbors on the east to Petrograd and Kronstadt, the nurseries of Bolshevism, on the west to the birthplace and stamping ground of those Prussian landowners who had proved themselves to be the most rigid element in the German system and one of the most formidable. During the winter of 1918 and the early summer of 1919, the Baltic states were subjected, alternately, to the rigors of Prussian and Bolshevik domination. Immediately after the armistice, the retiring Germans mischievously yielded their military material to the Bolsheviks, who quickly overran Estonia and a large part of Latvia and Lithuania. Assisted by Finnish volunteers and British war material, the Estonians drove back the Bolsheviks at the beginning of February 1919, but the Lats and Lithuanians were not so successful. While these events were in progress, the Germans under von der Goltz organized an unauthorized partisan force ultimately numbering 20,000 men, which was intended to turn out the Russians and establish in their stead, and in spite of anything the peace conference might decide, a refuge for the distressed nobility of East Prussia. They were temporarily successful and exercised, like the Free Companies, a fierce and adventurous license until the arrival in July of an Allied military mission. In these circumstances, it is not surprising that the independence of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania existed for the time being only in the aspiration of their inhabitants and the sympathies of the Allied and associated powers. Let us turn to Poland. In March 1917, the Russian Provisional Government had, as we have seen, declared that Poland should be an independent state attached to Russia by a free military union. At Brest-Litovsk, Trotsky proposed the independence of Poland, and this was embodied in the treaty. But the Polish troops in the Russian army were anti-Bolshevik, and the Polish Legion in the Ukraine soon revolted against the Russian Soviet Commissariat supervision of Polish national affairs. The representative in Moscow of the Polish Regency Council was also at once in full clash with the Soviet government. One of those rugged figures which came to the succor of peoples in tribulation now appeared upon the scene: Joseph Pilsudski. Pilsudski was born in Lithuania in October 1867, and he was therefore brought up amongst peasants who had a first-hand recollection of the atrocities committed after the insurrection of 1863. At the age of 22, he became involved with Russian revolutionaries and was condemned to 5 years' deportation to Siberia. He returned to Vilna in 1892, and 4 years later was again arrested for sedition, but escaped. During these years he was intermittently linked with Boris Savinkov, and a lifelong friendship was formed between the two men. Pilsudski, in consequence of these events, naturally looked on Russia as the principal enemy of his country. At the outbreak of war in 1914, he devoted himself to raising a volunteer force for use against Russia and make Galicia the base of his operations. But he entered into no engagement with either Germany or Austria. He had no illusions as to what the fate of Poland would be if the Central Empires emerged victorious from the war. While fighting under their aegis against Russia and her allies, he remembered always the ancient Greek saying, "Love as you shall hereafter hate, and hate as if you shall hereafter love." The Russian Revolution changed the scene. Tsardom disappeared, and the implicit conflict between Pilsudski and the Central Powers became manifest. At the end of July 1917, he refused to swear allegiance to them. He was imprisoned at Magdeburg. On regaining his liberty immediately after the armistice of November 1918, Pilsudski was acclaimed as leader not only by the patriotic military associations, which had been growing up during the German occupation, but by the Polish nation as a whole. He proceeded to Warsaw, disarmed the German soldiers left there, and assumed with profound national assent all the powers of the Regency Council. At the end of January 1919, Pilsudski, retaining in fact dictatorial authority, entrusted the formation of the government to Paderewski, the great pianist. But the Polish nation had now risen again to its feet. The ancient state, torn into 3 pieces by Austria, Prussia, and Russia, had been liberated from its oppressors and reunited in its integrity after 150 years of bondage and partition. In the Ukraine, the Bolsheviks had from the first taken up the challenge of separation. The Germans had signed their separate peace treaty with the Ukrainian government centered upon Kharkov. But another Ukrainian government at Kiev, in sympathy with the Bolsheviks, carried on armed resistance, both against counter-revolutionary Kharkov and the arriving Germans seeking corn and oil. The Ukrainian population was distracted by the double collision between anti-Germanism and anti-communism, between the foreign invaders and the domestic infection. These conflicting lines of pitiless quarrel ran through every town, street, village, and family, and even individuals were often at a loss to tell which side of their changing partisanships they hated most. But German efficiency and discipline pushed steadily through all these feeble, passionate cross-currents. With small bodies of good soldiers, they rapidly occupied most of the regions necessary to their replenishment. On March 13, 1918, they occupied Odessa. On the 17th, Nikolaev. On April 8, they took Kherson. On the 28th, they established a military dictatorship in the Ukraine under their local nominee, General Skoropadsky. On May 1, they occupied Sevastopol, seizing part of the Russian Black Sea Fleet. On May 8, they took Rostov-on-the-Don. In all these operations resulting in the effective acquisition of a rich, fertile area the size of a considerable country, not more than 5 reserve divisions of the German army were employed. Everything is relative. Everyone remembers and tries to forget the German occupation of Belgium. Here in the Ukraine, these same Germans came as deliverers and were spontaneously recognized as such, not only by the general population, but by those patriotic elements most hostile to the invaders of Russia. A dose of communism induces a desire in any population to welcome any other form, even the harshest, of civilized authority. With the arrival of the German steel helmets, life again became tolerable. One had only to submit, keep quiet, and obey. Thereafter everything was smooth and efficient. Better the iron heel of the foreign soldier than unresting persecution by a priesthood of blackguards and fanatics. Footnote: a moving account of this phase is found in Once I Had a Home, the Diary of Madeida, Lady of Honor to the late Empress of Russia. End of footnote. The situation in Bessarabia was curious and painful in a different way. The remnants of the Romanian army and leading elements of the Romanian people found a refuge on Russian territory after the conquest of their native land. They were sheltered by the Tsar. The revolution and the negotiations of Brest-Litovsk rendered their position desperate. The old affinity between Romania and Bessarabia and the unceasing quarrel between Russia and Romania about this province since the Russo-Turkish War of 1878 revived simultaneously. On the same day, January 28, that the Red Guards entered Helsingfors, in the north, the Bolsheviks declared war upon Romania. The Romanians were in no condition to resist, but German authority intervened and a peace was signed 6 weeks later. Then, in the depth of her suffering, Romania, captive and ruined, attained her heart's desire. On April 9, Bessarabia proclaimed her unity with Romania, subject to autonomy. The ceaseless advance of the German forces in southern Russia forced the Soviet to content themselves with an empty protest. Such was the vast panorama of anarchy and confusion, of strife and famine, of obligation and opportunity presented to the Western conquerors on Armistice Day.